Sticking in the NFL before we get out of here on a Friday, the NFL has been mired in a controversy surrounding, obviously, the new Imagine campaign social justice initiative deal and partnership that it entered in with Jay-Z. Jay-Z and Rock Nation entering into a partnership with the NFL to help bring change as far as social justice issues are concerned through music. Rock Nation having creative control over who performs and the performances at things like the Super Bowl, which is in Miami this year, as far as Super Bowl 54 is concerned. And ironically, a player in Miami for the Miami Dolphins and a head coach for the Miami Dolphins have been in the news over the last few days with respect to this whole Jay-Z NFL deal. Now, Kenny Stills is a wide receiver for the Miami Dolphins. Kenny Stills, of course, has been one of the players that has protested along with guys like Eric Reed and Colin Kaepernick before he was systematically blackballed out of the NFL. Kenny Stills has been one of the players that has consistently spoken out about these issues and continued to protest with respect to these issues. And he had some interesting things to say and was critical not necessarily critical. Let me back that up. Kenny Stills had a very measured perspective on what this deal means between Jay-Z and the NFL. Kenny Stills understands that there is a right to reserve judgment based on the deal that has been struck by Jay-Z and the NFL. And until the details and until the progress, until the actions unfold with respect to this deal, it's very hard for a lot of us, and I've said it on this show also, it's very hard to judge Jay-Z for the deal that he made. Well, his head coach, Brian Flores, wasn't necessarily feeling the idea of Kenny Stills talking about this publicly. So apparently, Brian Flores, a couple of days ago in practice, decided that he was going to, quote-unquote, challenge his player, Kenny Stills, and proceeded to start practice by playing, I believe it was 7 or 8 consecutive Jay-Z songs. Now, here is Brian Flores explaining why he felt he was to challenge Kenny Stills by playing those 7, 8 Jay-Z songs in a row. Here's what Brian Flores had to say about it.
Scripture before. So everything that these guys protest, I've lived it. I've experienced it. So yeah, I applauded those guys protest. So Kaepernick or Eric Reed or any, I applaud those guys. I told Kenny that in our meeting in front of the entire team. So that's where I stand on this thing. I think it got way more press than it needed to. I'm trying to challenge one of my players. I'm going to do that how I see fit. And look, what these guys protested, I was supported. I lived it. I experienced it. I don't know how many people have, but I lived it. So I understand why guys protest. And it's important. And you know what else is important to me? That guys performed it. 89 guys in that locker room were counting on Kenny to get over and catch the football and perform for this team. And that's important to me. And if anybody's got a problem with that, then we just got a problem. We're going to agree to disagree. And I feel like that's important. That's where I stand on this. Whatever scrutiny or media or whatever I get, then that's what I get. I believe that, and that's it. I lived it. I mean, I don't know I don't know how many people here, but I lived it. That's where I'm at on that. It was a challenge to Kenny to perform regardless of whatever's going on outside. And I would say, and I've said this to him, he hasn't performed up to that level over the course of this training camp as I've seen him. So that was a challenge.
Thanks to Cameron Wolf of ESPN for allowing us to use that video and that sound that was last night after the Jaguars-Dolphins preseason game where Brian Flores addressed the media about the situation with him and Kenny Stills. And, I tweeted about this earlier today and have been going back and forth with people all day about this. And what I tweeted out earlier was that this was an odd way of going about trying to challenge a player to be better. How about coaching him? Now, there's several pieces of this that I want to try and unpack in this short amount of time. Look, Kenny Stills addressed these comments by his coach in his own post-game comments by saying, look, man, I've dealt, and I'm paraphrasing here, I've dealt with racial slurs, I've dealt with booing, I've dealt with a whole lot of other things that have had much more significance on me than some music. Like, it was music, basically talking about the idea of what Brian Flores did as far as playing those Jay-Z songs consecutively to start practice. Your man came back in the locker room and subsequently started playing some Nas music, but that's another conversation for another day. But listen here. What I don't understand about Brian Flores and the method that he chose, because on the one hand, he understands, he says, what these players are going through and why they're kneeling. He understands that because he's lived it and understands it and supports his players by doing it. But on the other hand, he decides that a tactic to motivate one of his players is to use an issue that is divisive right now in the NFL and an issue that continues to plague this country and use it as a motivator to try and get his player to be better in training camp and be better to perform for his football team. I find that to be completely absurd on a number of levels. Number one, first of all, Brian Flores hasn't accomplished anything in the NFL to allow him to use this kind of passive, aggressive tactic to try and motivate a player. Number two, to use a particular issue that is as important, is as divisive, and is as controversial as this, and the way that it's been not only carried out by the NFL and its inability to handle it correctly, to the way that players feel about this issue, more importantly, the way that Kenny Stills has handled this issue, to me is really naive on his part. Because in my mind, why would Brian Flores think in his mind it would be a good idea to use a passive-aggressive tactic by playing music of an artist who struck a deal with the NFL where we don't know necessarily the details about what specifically is going to happen, but then in turn use that issue to try and drive motivation out of a player, and that music doesn't even move him. Kenny Stills said, look, man, this didn't move me. So why in the world would Brian Flores, desperate however he may be, turn to a tactic that is racially motivated by trying to motivate a player to do better because it may strike a chord with him that has nothing to do with his performance on the football field? That is the major problem that I have here. I don't understand where Brian Flores comes off, on the one hand, understanding of Kenny Stills' frustration, his protests, and the things that he's trying to do and getting this message across, but on the one hand, and then on the other hand, trolling him by playing Jay-Z's music as an idea to motivate him. Here's what Brian Flores should have done. If Brian Flores felt that and feels that Kenny Stills isn't playing at the level that he should be playing at, Brian Flores should coach better. He should teach better. He should show Kenny Stills what he needs to improve on instead of using passive-aggressive tactics to somehow try to manipulate a player to doing things better on a football field that have nothing to do with what actually is taking place on the football field. Kenny Stills has done and gone through much more to remain in the league based on what he has said that he has dealt with, and that is my other issue. What made Brian Flores think that playing Jay-Z music would create some more additional level of adversity for Kenny Stills to try and learn and overcome that Kenny Stills hasn't already learned and overcome by dealing with racial slurs, booing, and all the other things, death threats, and all the things that have come with what he has done over the last few years in terms of taking a knee and protesting? That is what I do not understand. And folks have tried to come at me and say, look, Kevin, Brian Flores was desperate. He understands the pulse of the players. He's trying to use a motivational tactic to get to Kenny Stills by striking a chord with him that has to do with something that's important to Kenny Stills. Look, the issue is important to Kenny Stills. It has nothing to do with his ability to catch the football. And to think, and for Brian Flores to be a black head coach in the NFL, part of the only black head coach, GM, personnel grouping in the NFL, and then to use this issue of race and use this issue that is so divisive and so controversial as a means to try to motivate a player, to me is absurd. And it's really disappointing by Brian Flores to be in this position. Brian Flores, I think, is a really smart guy. I think he's a measured guy. I think he has a measure of perspective that a lot of head coaches don't have in this league, especially being under the Bill Belichick head coaching tree and understanding what it means to run an organization. But what he cannot do is weaponize an issue to try and motivate a player to make him be better with issues that don't have anything to do with his ability to catch the football, his ability to run routes, and his ability to be better in the classroom as far as learning how to play the game of football. That is where Brian Flores went wrong. That is disappointing, and that is sad. Because for a black man to weaponize racial issues as a motivator to help a player get better on the football field and think that's a good idea, to me is kind of scary. Because to me, it now makes me question the other approaches that Brian Flores would take in order to try and make his players better. What other issues or what other means of approach would he use to help other players get better if he felt like they weren't performing to the standards that he feels like they should perform at? If he's willing to use an issue like this to try and create motivation for a player where clearly that player wasn't moved, Kenny Stills was not moved by this trolling of his head coach Brian Flores, what other measures will you go to try and motivate your players? This is 2019, and Brian Flores said something very interesting in that sound if you heard it. He said, I didn't think this would be something that would blow up and be as big as it was. Does he not understand what time it is in 2019 with Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all the means of social media and all the ways that this stuff can get out? I understand Brian Flores is a real old school cat when it comes to trying to get players motivated. This ain't it, though. You cannot, and if I'm Kenny Stills and I'm in this situation, I feel ultimately disrespected from my head coach. Here's why. Number one, if I'm Kenny Stills, I feel like my head coach thinks I'm stupid. Because to think that I would not have the measure and the understanding and the perspective to separate what's happening off the football field with what's happening on the football field, and for then my head coach to think that I would be motivated by things that are happening off of the football field to make me better on it is ridiculous. That, to me, if I'm Kenny Stills, makes me feel like you don't think I can make the necessary adjustments based on you coaching me, based on you helping me, based on you showing me what I can do to get better. You feel like you need to use other means that have nothing to do with me getting better on the football field as a means to try and motivate me, get me angry, get me to perform better. That's the wrong way to approach this. And I cannot stand the fact that a coach in his position who's been around as long as he has would use such a passive, aggressive tactic to try and get to a player when he knows if he actually really understood Kenny Stills and actually took the time to understand the issues that Kenny Stills is trying to deal with and navigate and what he's been through and the adversity that he's already overcome. If he understood that, he would not have went down this road and trying to use that issue to try and get Kenny Stills to play better. Because again, these things outside of football are much bigger, and Kenny Stills understands that. Brian Flores says with his words that he understands what his players are going through and respects Eric Reed and Colin Kaepernick and Kenny Stills for what they are doing because he's quote-unquote lived it. If he truly lived it and truly understood it, he would know that using race, especially a black man to another black man, and trying to help him get better does not come in the form of passive-aggressive tactics by using things that are weaponized, that are important in our culture to try and make someone get better. That doesn't happen. That shouldn't happen, especially with this color of this head coach and this color of this player. And even irrespective of color, this is not a tactic that any coach should use with any issue with respect to trying to get a player and make them better. That shouldn't happen at all. But for this to happen with these two individuals, with the issue that we're dealing with, and then for Kenny Stills, a guy who I admire and respect for what he has done. He continues to call out his owner, Stephen Ross, who they got off the board of the Players Coalition after he decided to throw a fundraiser of $250,000 a plate for Donald Trump and this, that, and the third. The Players Coalition was like, nah, the things that you're doing are not in line with the words that you've been saying about how you want to help, how the Players Coalition needs to be helped by you, so we're going to get you out of here. And Stephen Ross ultimately resigning off the Players Coalition. Kenny Stills called out his owner on multiple occasions about that. Kenny Stills understands what's really going on here. Brian Flores needs to get a grip. But more importantly, Brian Flores needs to understand that the relationship with his players is the most important. But before trying to go and motivating players based on things that he's assuming will get them motivated. Because that's the ultimate fatal flaw of this whole situation with Ryan Flores. He simply did not take the time to ask, or at least it doesn't appear he didn't take the time to ask Kenny Stills, hey man, what gets you motivated before going off and doing this? Brian Flores, be better. Be much better, sir.